The moment the lights settled over SoFi Stadium, Bruno Mars and Karol G turned a massive Los Angeles concert into something unexpectedly intimate, a slow, emotional performance of Risk It All that brought the two stars together at center stage and sent the crowd into an eruption. Karol G was performing her Viajando por el Mundo Tropitour at SoFi Stadium, one of 3 scheduled Los Angeles dates on August 14, 15, and 16, 2026. Ticketmaster lists the August 16th performance as the 3rd Los Angeles show of the run. But for fans watching the special collaboration, the scale of the stadium suddenly seemed to disappear. The focus was no longer on thousands of people. It was on 2 performers, 1 song, and a moment that felt almost cinematic. At the heart of the performance was Risk It All, a song that has become an important part of Bruno Mars' 2026 musical era. Released as part of his album, The Romantic, the song was built around complete emotional surrender. Its Spanish counterpart, Lo Arriesgo Todo, arrived on May 8th, giving the song a new linguistic and cultural dimension. Official streaming listings show both versions together as part of the same single release. That background matters because the performance was not simply a surprise guest appearance. It brought together a song about taking an emotional risk with 2 artists whose musical identities occupied different but increasingly connected worlds. And then came the visual moment that changed the atmosphere. Bruno Mars and Karol G moved closer together as the performance unfolded. Rather than turning the collaboration into a high-energy spectacle, the two slowed the pace. They faced one another, sang together, and moved with the rhythm in a brief slow dance sequence that immediately became the emotional center of the performance. For the audience inside SoFi Stadium, the reaction was immediate. The energy that had filled the venue throughout the concert shifted into something softer, then exploded again as fans recognized what was happening. It is the kind of concert moment that works because it does not need to be complicated. 2 major stars. 1 romantic song. A stadium full of people watching. Bruno Mars has always understood the power of performance. His career has been built not only on songs but on timing, choreography, musicianship, showmanship, and an ability to make enormous venues feel personal. His 2026 era has expanded that approach through The Romantic, an album centered heavily on romance, classic songwriting, and a more intimate musical atmosphere. Risk It All fits that identity almost perfectly. The song was released on February 27, 2026, and its Spanish version, Lo Arriesgo Todo, followed in May. Apple Music credits Bruno Mars as both songwriter and producer, alongside collaborators including Ernst Emile II, James Fauntleroy, and Philip Lawrence. That is important because the song is not merely a catalog track revived for a special appearance. It is part of the current creative chapter Bruno is actively presenting to audiences. The Spanish version also proved that this chapter could travel naturally into the Latin music space. Billboard Argentina reported that Lo Arriesgo Todo became Bruno Mars' first studio recording entirely in Spanish and debuted on several Billboard Latin charts. The song reached number 1 on Latin pop songs and Latin digital song sales, while also entering Hot Latin Songs. That makes the pairing with Karol G especially significant. Karol G is one of the most influential Colombian artists in contemporary Latin music. Her Viajando por el Mundo Tropitour brought her to major American stadiums, including 3 nights at SoFi Stadium. Ticketmaster describes the 2026 tour as part of her continuing rise as a global superstar, and notes that her previous Mañana Será Bonito tour became the 2nd highest grossing Latin tour during its run. So when Bruno Mars stepped into that environment, the collaboration carried more weight than a typical concert cameo. It represented a meeting between 2 enormous audiences. One audience knows Bruno for the polished pop, soul, funk, and R&B performances that made him one of the biggest live entertainers of his generation. Another knows Karol G as a defining figure in Latin music and as an artist who has helped bring Spanish-language music deeper into the American mainstream. Arriesgo Todo sits directly between those worlds. The song itself is built around a simple emotional idea. If love is worth having, you have to be willing to risk everything for it. In Spanish, that idea takes on another texture. The phrasing feels warmer and more intimate, allowing the melody to sound almost conversational. That is one reason the slow dance moment landed so strongly. The performance did not depend on a giant production trick. It depended on contrast. Bruno Mars can command an entire stadium with choreography and an explosive band. Karol G can turn a stadium into a giant celebration of Latin music. But when the two artists slowed down and simply shared the center of the stage, the audience was given something different. A pause. A breath. A moment of vulnerability inside an enormous production. And that is precisely where Bruno Mars has always been particularly effective. His strongest performances often come when the spectacle becomes secondary to the song. The voice comes forward. The melody becomes the story. The performer stops trying to impress the audience, and instead invites the audience into the emotion. That dynamic was especially noticeable here. The visual language of the performance suggested intimacy, but it is important not to confuse stage chemistry with evidence of a personal romantic relationship. There is no basis in the performance itself to claim that Bruno Mars and Karol G are romantically involved outside the stage. What the footage demonstrates is professional collaboration, physical proximity as part of the performance, and a shared interpretation of a romantic song. That distinction matters. The power of the moment does not require speculation. In fact, the performance is more interesting when viewed for what it actually represents: two global artists using music to create a temporary world inside a stadium. For Bruno, the collaboration also arrives at an important point in his career. The Romantic marks a major new phase following years in which fans repeatedly waited for another full Bruno Mars album and headline tour. His 2026 tour is his first full headlining stadium tour in nearly a decade, according to event information promoting the run. SoFi Stadium itself is also part of that story. Karol G occupied the venue for 3 consecutive nights in August. Weeks later, Bruno Mars is scheduled to bring the Romantic Tour to the same stadium beginning September 30th, with additional dates in October. That creates an unusual connection between the two artists and the Los Angeles venue. Karol G brought Bruno into her world. Soon, Bruno will bring his own world back to the same building. And perhaps that is why the duet feels bigger than a single guest appearance. The performance connects two sides of the current music landscape that are becoming increasingly difficult to separate. English-language pop and Latin music no longer operate in isolated lanes. Artists move between languages, audiences, genres, and cultures with greater freedom than ever before. Bruno's decision to release Arriesgo Todo in Spanish was already evidence of that shift. Performing it alongside Karol G in Los Angeles made the idea visible. There was also something symbolic about the choice of song. Risk It All is not a song about playing it safe. Its emotional premise is surrender. The Spanish title, Arriesgo Todo, says essentially the same thing: I risk everything. On a night when two superstars stood together in front of a stadium crowd, the title suddenly felt almost like a description of the collaboration itself. Bruno Mars was stepping into Karol G's stadium show. Karol G was sharing the spotlight with one of the world's most recognizable pop performers. And both were trusting the song to carry the moment. That trust is what made the performance feel natural. Instead of forcing a crossover into a massive spectacle, the two artists allowed the emotional character of the song to lead. The result was a performance that could be understood even by viewers who knew nothing about the surrounding story. The music began. The two voices met. The distance between them narrowed. They moved together. And the stadium reacted. For a YouTube audience watching the footage after the fact, that progression is precisely what makes the clip so compelling. The viewer does not need to know every detail of the tour. The emotional transformation is visible. At the beginning, it is a concert. Then it becomes a collaboration. Then it becomes a slow dance. And suddenly the entire stadium feels like it is watching something personal. That is the magic of live music. A recording can preserve a song, but a live performance can create a moment that exists only once. The official release of Lo Arriesgo Todo already gave Bruno Mars an important bridge into Spanish-language music. Billboard's reporting on its chart performance showed that the song was not simply a novelty. It immediately found measurable traction in the Latin music market. The SoFi Stadium performance adds another layer. It demonstrates how naturally the song can exist outside the studio. It also shows why the combination with Karol G makes sense musically. Her voice and performance style bring a Latin sensibility to a song that Bruno had already designed around romantic intensity. Instead of feeling like two unrelated artists sharing a stage, the collaboration feels connected by the material. And that connection is what the audience responded to. The biggest surprise may not have been Bruno Mars appearing. It may have been what he and Karol G chose to do once they were together. A louder performance would have been easy. A dance-heavy number would have fit the scale of the stadium. But they chose restraint. That restraint created anticipation. Every movement became more noticeable. Every glance felt more deliberate. Every vocal exchange carried more weight because the performance was not overwhelmed by choreography. Then came the reaction. SoFi Stadium erupted. Not because something had exploded on stage, but because the audience understood the emotional significance of what it was seeing. For Bruno Mars, this is another reminder of why his live performances remain so closely watched. He does not need to dominate every second of a show. Sometimes his greatest strength is knowing when to step back and let a song breathe. For Karol G, the collaboration reinforces the global scale of her current era. Her tour is already taking her through some of the largest stadiums in North America, and bringing an artist of Bruno's stature into the Los Angeles show adds another headline-worthy chapter. But ultimately, the story belongs to the song. Risk It All was written as a declaration of emotional commitment. Lo Arriesgo Todo carried that message into Spanish. And at SoFi Stadium, Bruno Mars and Karol G turned that message into a live performance built around closeness, restraint, and connection. There is no need to manufacture a scandal around it. There is no need to turn a stage moment into a rumor. The footage already provides the headline. Bruno Mars and Karol G stood together under the lights, sang one of the most romantic songs of Bruno's current era, and slowed the performance down long enough for an enormous stadium to become completely focused on them. That is why the moment is resonating. Because for a few minutes, the spectacle disappeared. The superstar disappeared. The stadium disappeared. There was only the song. And two artists willing to risk everything for the performance. As Bruno Mars continues the romantic era and prepares to return to SoFi Stadium for his own headline dates later this year, the Los Angeles collaboration with Karol G now stands as a memorable snapshot of where his music is heading, more global, more romantic, and increasingly comfortable crossing cultural boundaries without losing the musicianship that made him a superstar in the first place. And perhaps that is the final twist in the story. The title, Risk It All, sounds dramatic. But on this night, it did not need to be. The risk was simply allowing two voices, two performers, and one emotional song to take over a stadium. They did. And SoFi Stadium answered.